5. Overarching Concepts of Critical Thinking. It can be helpful to generally explore the three major or overarching concepts of critical thinking. I'm going to introduce to you a definition of critical thinking, but I want you to focus not so much on the definition itself, but on the constituent parts that make up this definition. I believe that any good definition of critical thinking should consist of, or at least give some treatment of, these three basic constituent elements. It's somewhat like the constituent parts of an atom. In the classical model, an atom consisted of electrons, neutrons, and protons. Now, of course, today we know that the atom itself consists of many more fundamental particles than these, but for our purposes, I want you to think of three constituent parts of critical thinking. And just like today's conception of an atom, we know there are many more, but these three particular parts have a special relationship to one another. The definitions I will be using are paraphrased from the outstanding work of Dr. Richard Paul and Linda Elder. Here is the first definition. Critical thinking is reflecting upon a body of reasoning, either your own or someone else's, analyzing it, and applying standards to it in order to improve upon it. Additionally, critical thinkers adopt certain habits of the mind that make critical thinking possible. In other words, to put this in a more succinct and I hope memorable way, critical thinking is thinking about your thinking to make it better and adopting traits that make it possible. Let me say that again. Critical thinking is thinking about your thinking to make it better and adopting traits that make it possible. Dr. Richard Paul uses a definition very much like this. Now I want you to try to step back mentally in your perspective and think about this definition. This definition consists of three constituent parts. First, this definition introduces the concept of thinking itself, and it implies a deeper understanding of what thinking consists of, its constituent elements. Secondly, it introduces an idea or concept of improvement, of making it better, of applying criteria or standards. And finally, it speaks of certain traits that make critical thinking possible. These three constituent concepts would be found in any good definition of critical thinking. They're interrelated. The three groupings of concepts, namely the elements of reasoning, it's 1, 2, the standards of reasoning, and 3, the intellectual traits applied to reasoning, are like three legs of a bar stool. Without any one of these major concepts, the stool will topple over. The definition of critical thinking would not be complete, could not stand on its own. They are necessary parts of the definition. This definition directly applies to the Pauline model of critical thinking. Each stool leg is made up of parts. We'll get to these parts later, but for right now, let's focus on how these three concepts are related to one another. The elements of reasoning are what you're sensitive to when you're thinking about your thinking. The standards of reasoning are what you're sensitive to when you want to make your thinking better. And the intellectual traits are what you're sensitive to when you want to ensure that you're truly thinking critically. You see, they're all related. You can't think critically, or your thinking will be flawed to the degree that you fail to properly apply these groups of concepts in your thinking. Try to keep these three concepts in mind. Realize that these three concepts are present in any good definition of critical thinking. They will help you to learn and to remember the definition. In our next presentation, the 6th out of 34, I will show you an easy way of remembering the fundamental elements of reasoning.